This week, it's the last episode of 2021, so it's also a good time for a New Year's overview of some of the big trends and stories in the Jewish world. It's been yet another wild year of news keeping all of us exhausted, and this podcast busy with trying to cover it. So let's chat about it. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. Before jumping in, if you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. A link to our Teespring store is available in the podcast notes, as well as just a link to donate if you want to give directly. We appreciate any support you can give. I also want to say thank you to everyone who has listened to The Jews Are Tired in 2021. I was checking the podcast metrics recently and realized that a lot of you are really consistent listeners from a much wider area than I was expecting. Something like 17% of my listeners aren't even in the US, tuning in from all around the world, from Israel, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and a lot of other places I wasn't expecting, like a really specific city in Japan, for example, where someone consistently downloads this podcast. And of the US downloads, almost 2/3 are not even in Minnesota, which is kind of cool and kind of weird, seeing as this is just a, little Jewish podcast from the Twin Cities. So wherever you are in the world, really, truly, thank you for listening. I hope you're doing okay, and maybe even better than okay, as 2021 draws to a close. Also, it would be cool to hear from you, where you are, why you listen to me month after month, and what I can maybe do to improve the podcast to make it a better experience for you. If you want to be in touch, or if you just want to, send some hate mail for fun, I don't know what you do in your free time, my email is lev@tcgfolk.com. It'll also be in the podcast notes, so send me a message, say hello. Well, I guess this is going to be a kind of bantery episode, so I apologize, but let's get to, the actual Jewish news part of the Jewish News podcast. If I wasn't trying to be mildly professional, I'd definitely have some whiskey while recording this episode because, wow, who wants to think back on another year with all the magical, wonderful stuff that has happened and an ongoing pandemic to boot? So the first kind of 2021 Jewish news thing I want to cover is actually several bits of news, but all tied loosely into one event in my mind. That event is where this podcast started at the beginning of this year, with the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., where a mob of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and supporters of former President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol of the United States in an effort to get Congress to not certify President Joe Biden's election victory. In other words, they were trying to violently overthrow a legitimate election, and they did so because Trump told them to and insisted that the election had been stolen from him. It was an earth-shattering event where I remember just reading the tweets about all of a sudden there's this mob and they're breaking into the Capitol. And then I turned on the TV to, CBS News or ABC News, whatever, and just watched this unfold while talking to some friends at the same time as we tried to all just process what was going on. It was just unbelievable. And it also unfortunately made perfect sense at some level that we would end up here as a country. Trump had been riling up right-wing extremists before he even became president, and things were bound to explode the way that they did. But what's notable about this, and where we start getting to the offshoots of this event in the rest of 2021, is that Trump had been riling up extremists with the approval and participation of the rest of the Republican Party. This wasn't one guy talking to some group of weirdos. This was a mainlining of white supremacist rhetoric across the entire Republican Party that legislators and party members at all levels went along with. And Jews, like many other minorities in this country, could see and feel that violence and domestic terrorism was normalized in a way that they had just not been for a very long time. If you want to go back to my original lowdown on this, you can go back and listen to episode 50 of this podcast. But to move forward on the timeline, Joe Biden obviously still became president, something a majority of Jews voted for, of course, but a new administration also raised the question of how American Jewish priorities were going to play out this time. Some of that was as basic as seeing, how many Jews the Biden administration was hiring and nominating for positions, and the anxiety that many of us feel around Jews being so publicly involved in politics. It's just so easy for anti-Semites to talk about Jews controlling everything when there are a bunch of Jews around the President of the United States of America. So I had a great conversation about this with Alex Zeldin, a fellow Russian-speaking Jew who is also a columnist for The Forward, which you can revisit by listening to episode 51 of this podcast. The short answer to all of this was, anti-Semites are going to anti-Semite anyway, whether there are Jews in politics or not. But that was a really novel concern for the start of a new presidency, and some more important Jewish priorities emerged over the course of the year. Take, for example, filling the position of the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, which is now an ambassador-level position at the State Department. The position is pretty much what it sounds like, the United States point person for anti-Semitism worldwide. Filling that position is kind of a big deal when we know anti-Semitism has been on the rise, and it's also a huge deal for Jewish representation in this country that we have a federal spokesperson on issues of hatred against Jews. So it took a little while, but by the end of July, the Biden administration decided to nominate noted historian and almost universally well-regarded anti-Semitism scholar Deborah Lipstadt to be the anti-Semitism envoy. The catch is that as an ambassador-level position, she had to get Senate confirmation. And half a year later, the Senate still hasn't approved Lipstadt to the job. In November, Jewish Insider reported why, because Senate Republicans are delaying the hearing to confirm her. You see, as an expert on anti-Semitism and as a person on Twitter, Lipstadt has loudly condemned anti-Semitism from all places, political left, political right, up, down, you name it. But notice that political right happens to include the Republican Party. I'm not going to list all the examples of what she's called out. I don't want to make this episode that long. But one notable reason Republicans don't like her is also because when Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican from Wisconsin, said that he wasn't concerned during the January 6th insurrection, but would have been concerned if the mob was Black Lives Matter or Antifa, Lipstadt criticized him on Twitter and said, quote, "This is white supremacy." So that's how the insurrection and the state of the Republican Party makes an appearance in blocking Jewish priorities. In a joint letter to the Senate, the Jewish Federations of North America, the Orthodox Union, and the Anti-Defamation League all asked the Senate to stop messing around and to hurry up and confirm Lipstadt already as anti-Semitism envoy. So I guess we'll just have to hope that the confirmation happens in 2022. Another Jewish priority that has seen some interesting political spinning this year is funding for an extra $1 billion for the Iron Dome, a rocket defense system used by Israel. After the war in May between Hamas, the terrorist group that runs Gaza, and Israel, Israel's supply of the special missiles used by the Iron Dome to shoot down rockets was somewhat depleted. So on top of the normal yearly funding that the U.S. sends to Israel for the Iron Dome, Israel asked for this $1 billion, ostensibly to get more of the special missiles they need. For more background on the May war, check out episode 58. And just to be clear, aid for the Iron Dome is something pretty much every single major Jewish organization from left to right agrees on, with the basis being that the Iron Dome is not an offensive weapon, it literally just defends people and keeps them from dying. So when I say this is a Jewish priority, obviously you could say that and it's a generalization every time, but in terms of clear communal priorities, this is pretty obviously one of them. So first, this funding became a crisis for Democrats in September because the $1 billion was attached to a piece of legislation that was actually about funding the U.S. government and being able to pay off the country's debts. A group of progressive House Democrats did not think that the Iron Dome funding should be in this bill, so they raised a stink about voting for it unless Democratic leadership took the $1 billion out. If you want to learn more, revisit episode 60. So that's what happened. The $1 billion got taken out of this bill, and then everybody and their mother piled on to say that Democrats were being anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and this was internally too. Many moderate Democrats just ripped on progressives for this. So to save face and get everyone to shut up, House Democrats put the $1 billion for the Iron Dome into a separate bill and brought that to a vote. No surprise, the bill passed with huge bipartisan support. 8 Democrats voted against it, 2 Democrats simply voted present, and 1 Republican voted against it. The entire rest of the House, Democrats and Republicans, including some big-name progressive Democrats, voted to approve the funding. Fast forward to now, and the funding has been stuck in the Senate, thanks to the Republican Libertarian Senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. He has been blocking the funding for months. Rand Paul's whole shtick is that instead of giving the $1 billion outright, he wants to take the Iron Dome aid out of the money devoted to Afghanistan. He claims that's to make sure that the money doesn't reach the Taliban, but it seems like in actuality the Afghanistan money is mostly to help resettle refugees and navigate the chaotic end of America's withdrawal from the country. So Paul is functionally wanting to defund refugee aid to give it to the Iron Dome. This is pissing off both Democrats and many Republicans because if Democrats were anti-Israel for holding up the funding for a technical moment in September, it's a bad look for Republicans to be holding up Iron Dome aid for months, especially when they love to paint themselves as the real pro-Israel party. But what's curious is that Jews everywhere might have lost their sanity over progressive Democrats finagling in the House over this money, but Rand Paul has been able to do this pretty much without a fuss at all. No big explosive Jewish reaction, some statements, some bits and pieces, some stories, but nothing like what hit in September. Why get massively pissed at progressives but not Rand Paul? That is a great question. Everyone expects the money to go through at some point, but it's weird, isn't it? And by that I mean, no, it's actually not weird. It's the same double standard of Israel expectations that Democrats and Republicans have been living with for years now. It's just this year's version of it. So keep an eye out for the Iron Dome funding resolving in 2022, and if it doesn't, it'll be interesting to see what kind of condemnations of Rand Paul and Republicans comes out of this, if any at all. So, related to the years-long story of incitement by former President Trump that led to the January 6th insurrection is the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was a massive and terrifying gathering of white supremacists who stomped around chanting stuff like "Jews will not replace us," where a neo-Nazi purposefully ran over a group of counter-protesters with his car, killing one and injuring many others. Many Americans were frustrated that Trump did not condemn the rally enough, and the former president famously said that there were very fine people on both sides of the rally, meaning both the neo-Nazis and the counter-protesters. Obviously, that comment did not go over so well with many. So this past year, the organizers of the Unite the Right rally were actually sued, and the trial happened. They were sued under both state and federal law for planning racially motivated violence. There are some good links to explainer pieces from JTA, The Forward, and a tweet thread from a Jewish historian at the University of Virginia about the specific laws that the organizers were being sued under and the weirdness of the eventual jury ruling. The short of it is that the white supremacists were found guilty under state law, but when it came to federal law, the jury did not reach a conclusion. This is good news because there is some measure of accountability for what happened, and millions of dollars in damages were awarded to the people who sued the organizers of Unite the Right. But it's also kind of disappointing that the federal charges are unresolved, because if these neo-Nazis were found guilty under federal law for organizing racist violence, that might have set a larger precedent across the country instead of keeping things localized to Virginia. One of the goals of the nonprofit Integrity First for America, which brought this lawsuit, was to set that larger precedent for using the law to bankrupt, embarrass, and disrupt white supremacist organizations. So it's a little unclear if that goal has been met, but there's definitely a start. Okay, now to the last few bits of big Jewish news items in 2021 and where they leave us for this new year. I have spent many an episode of this podcast covering Israel, and specifically what seemed like a never-ending cycle of national elections. Longtime Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as his rivals, were evenly deadlocked with the number of seats they were elected to in the Knesset, Israel's 120-seat parliament, from 2019 to 2021. So there was no proper 61-seat majority of political parties to form a government over the course of 2 years and 4 national elections, except for a couple of months in mid-2020 before everything fell apart again. Well, in 2021, the national dysfunction finally ended, and Netanyahu ended his decade-long reign as prime minister. You might have heard a little about that during the conversation with noted Israeli-American author Yossi Klein Halevi on episode 62 of this podcast. I'm not going to go into overwhelming detail, but Netanyahu's rivals did something incredible. Not only did they create a wild and insane coalition of political parties spanning literally the right wing to the far left, but for the first time, an Arab Islamist political party is a member of the government in the Jewish state. In other words, Netanyahu's stubbornness and maneuvering drove this weird political renaissance and brought Arab Israelis closer into the political mainstream in a way that has been pretty much unacceptable to Jewish Israelis for decades. Again, go listen to the interview with Yossi Klein Halevi to get more info and perspective on that. But it's nice to see that 2021 was the year Israel finally got over its political gridlock. Now, that does not mean things are perfect, nor does it mean that the new government is doing a great job with many of the issues that diaspora Jews, and particularly many American Jews, care about. So stay tuned for coverage of that in 2022 because there's a lot to say on the subject. Lastly, at the end of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, got a mention on this podcast. Not only the way it challenged all of us, but the way that being forced to go online changed the conversation on how Jewish communities can and should be more accessible and welcoming. I thought that 2021, with vaccines finally coming out, would be the year that we got back to normal, went back to in-person everything, and applied the lessons of 2021 to figure out what in-person Jewish life should be like now. Obviously, I was wrong, because the pandemic is still very much ongoing, and now with the Omicron variant, many Jewish institutions have gone back to being virtual. There's a lot more I could say about all of this, from the absolute rage at people who will not get vaccinated in the United States and who are disproportionately dying of COVID, overwhelming healthcare systems to the point that patients with other significant health issues can't get the care they need and also die prematurely. There's a lot to say about the moral, ethical, and practical imperative for rich countries to bring vaccines to every corner of the world to truly slow down COVID. And there's loads to say about how the U.S. is still tripping over itself when it comes to responding to the pandemic, even though many of us voted for a new administration so that we would stop tripping. But, okay, to stay focused on the Jews, I think what's really frustrating is also that there are so many dreams and ideas about taking the awfulness of COVID, learning from our experience during it, and applying that experience to make better Jewish communities. Instead of finally being able to do so, though, it feels like we're still just struggling to stay afloat along with everyone and everything else. And it is so hard to try and keep things afloat and make things better at the same time, especially when everyone is exhausted and burnt out. So as we keep rolling through time and into the new year, I'm keeping in mind the exhausted healthcare workers, essential workers, parents, Jewish professionals, and teachers who are doing so much with so little, along with everyone else surviving this thing that we're all stuck in. So here's to the hope that 2022 treats everyone better and that everyone who can helps make 2022 better. With that in mind, Happy New Year, thanks for listening, and try to take some kind of break from all the things that make the Jews tired, because they're going to happen one way or another. And wow, that was not the positive ending that I wanted. Oops. Happy New Year. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next year, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode.